So you've got your list of standards. You've got the LOs from your department head. You have the benchmarks for your EOC exam at the end of the year. And yet you find that your students are further behind. They're lower than the bar. They're lower achieving than is expected of them for the course that they are in, that you are teaching them. Maybe this is an on grade level CP course, or maybe it's students in your honors section that probably shouldn't be there, that aren't performing at that expected honors level. How do you differentiate to serve these students that are achieving lower than is expected? And if I'm honest, I don't love that term, like lower achieving, but just like for simplicity and consistency's sake, we're going to continue to use it. And today, I'm going to share with you 9 tips for serving this population of students. And a final tip at the end that's really going to be specific for serving these students who are the outliers in a class that's designated as advanced. So most of these tips are going to be for your like on grade level course that's just like lower than it should be. It's really below grade level and it should be on. Like, how are you going to kind of bring them along? And at the end, we'll talk about specifically those students that are in that next level course, that are in that advanced course, and everyone else is kind of hanging in there and they're kind of falling behind. What's the number one recommendation I have for serving them and catching them up? And then remember, next week is where we're really going to put this all together and talk about, okay, you have a section, I don't care what it's labeled, on grade level, honors, whatever, but just the range in there is so vast. How are we serving these mixed levels in one place? Traditionally, we kind of separate our students in halves in most schools, into on grade level, into advanced, or honors versus CP. And so we're going to be talking today specifically towards that on grade level group. But the mixed talk is coming next week, so stay tuned. But let's get into these 9 tips about serving your lower achieving students. This is Secondary Science Simplified, a podcast for secondary science teachers who want to engage their students and simplify their lives. I'm Rebecca Joyner from It's Not Rocket Science. As a high school science teacher turned curriculum writer, I am passionate about helping other science teachers love their jobs, serve their students, and do it all in only 40 hours a week. Are you ready to rock the time you spend in your classroom and actually have a life outside of it? You are in the right place, teacher friend. Let's get to today's episode. First things first. No matter how behind or low or beneath the bar the students you've acquired seem to be when they get to your course, remember that you still have to cover the content. It doesn't matter if you have 2 students with IEPs and 504s or 20. You are still expected to cover the content that is assigned to your course, whether that's the standards, the learning objectives, whatever. There's a difference between accommodating and modifying. IEPs and 504s have accommodations for us to make to help level the playing field for all students, whereas modifications is actually making the core content and skills easier for some students. So we're not going to modify. We are going to always accommodate and serve those students and everything that they deserve with their accommodations, okay? But in order to know what this bar is, to even know if like the general mass in your class is behind it or ahead of it or whatever, you have to know your standards, y'all, and you need to know them backwards and forwards. And I would like to venture to say, you don't just need to like read them. I think the best way to know your standards and understand them and how they apply practically to your courses is to write objectives from your standards. So take your standards, and if you have not been given learning objectives for your course and for your standards, write them yourselves. Say, hey, this is something that I can give to my students, I can give to parents, and say, like, you're not going to send the NGSS to your sophomore chemistry parents and say, this is what we're learning. Like, that means, it barely means anything to us. It's not going to mean anything to them. But you can send a list of objectives and say, these are the things we're going to learn. These are the skills we're going to acquire. And I think when you do that, when you know your standards well, you translated those standards into applicable, clear objectives that your students, their parents, and you really understand. You know them backwards and forwards. Then you know what to focus on. What's the bare minimum we need to find success in the EOC, to pass this course, whatever. That becomes our starting point. Then You can add in things from there as you see fit. You can use your discretion there, not just for your honors courses, but for your on-grade level as well. For instance, NGSS does not expect students to know the steps in mitosis and meiosis, but I have personally found that it kind of helps them walk through the process a little bit easier if they see those names. They're names that they most likely saw in life science in 7th grade. So I like to bring those back up again. You can do that and not assess on it. You can do that and assess on it. It's up to your discretion. But I think one thing that's really important before we immediately just assume our students are really far behind is make sure we're really clear about where they should be. And I think oftentimes we don't actually know that very well. So let's get really crystal clear on that first. If you need help with that, I have an exercise in my lessons virtual professional development mini course that's all about like analyzing your standards and learning how to understand them for yourself. And so I'll link that in the show notes. But I just want to make sure that's clear first. We have to know our standards before we decide whether or not our students are not meeting the bar or they're low achieving or whatever. Okay. Now from there, if you know where your students should be, you know where you need to get with them, and it feels like we're struggling to get there and we're really far behind, here are my 9 tips for you. 1, clear expectations. Y'all, from day 1, if you can. Obviously, if you're listening to this when this airs in February, you're on day, 105 or something with your students. I don't know. But like, you're so far past day 1. I get it. But start now. Start with your next unit. Start on a Monday. We love a fresh start on a Monday with clear expectations. Acknowledge, like, hey, what has happened however many months prior to this, 5 months before this that we've been together, is not okay. It's not where we need to be. Some of this is on me. Some of it's on you, but I will take ownership of this. Here's where we're going moving forward. Make it very clear. Okay, we're going to be changing how the class is run. I'm going to have different expectations of you. So much of this with differentiation, y'all, it starts with the culture of your classroom. And that's such a bigger conversation than I can dive into right now in this episode. I'll link that virtual PD course as well about culture. But I definitely think starting with clear expectations with your students, make it so clear what you're expecting of them, where you're expecting to go, and make it clear how you're going to help them get there. This is one reason why I love using packets as my organizational tool for my instructional resources. At the beginning of every unit, I give each student a packet of all of their handouts for the entire unit. The cover page divides the unit into concepts, typically 3 to 6 per unit. Those concepts have objectives, skills, and vocabulary terms that I outline from day 1. This is where we're going. This is the goalpost. This is what you need to know for the test. Every instructional resource goes back to something on this cover page. Every assessment question goes back to something here. All of that goes back to standards. That's going to equip them for their EOC and all of that jazz. So I think just even starting with saying, this is what is expected of you, and here's how I'm going to help you get there, is so beneficial for students. So number 1, we're going to have really clear expectations. Number 2, for these classes that are the majority students that, are struggling a bit, are lower achieving, we're going to structure these classes with a lot more reinforcement. Because you're probably going to be covering more of like the bare minimum content and skills that you need, that means you're going to have shorter direct instruction, less notes, less depth that you're diving into, and hopefully then reclaiming more time that you can reallocate for reinforcing practice and extra lab time, which we'll talk about in a second. But that is the hope. That's where I think it's really important to, again, before we even got into the tips, get super clear on what do you actually have to teach your students, because you might be going way more into this than you need to. I will never forget when I took over AP Bio from the previous teacher, who I love and respect so dearly. That teacher had not been to an AP Summer Institute or any sort of College Board training since they rewrote the AP Bio exam. And so he was still teaching like the old school stuff. He was still using, FRQs from the 2007, 2008 exams. And the exam and the course had changed so much. And y'all, he gave me all of his lecture notes. He gave me all of his resources. He was so generous in that. But what I found after going to AP Summer Institute and being challenged by my teacher there to really study the CD and know it backwards and forwards, I really found like, Oh, he is going into way more detail. I mean, he's having the students memorize all of the enzymes and cellular respiration, like all these different things we didn't need to do. And when I started trimming out all of this excess stuff that he had put in, I found that I had way less that I actually had to teach, which created more space to do what I just said. Have reinforcing practice on those really challenging skills, which for my students was unfortunately so much of like the graphing and lab skills. And of course, a lot of the math where they were a lot weaker. So we got to have more time reinforcing those skills. And then the labs in AP Bio are really challenging. And we had more time to spend on labs, which we'll talk about also again in a minute. So make sure you're creating space, you're knowing your standards well enough that you're not teaching more than you have to so that you can create more time for more reinforcement. These students, they need more than just one practice handout. They need a couple. Now, where do we find the space in our class periods in order to have more time for this reinforcing? That comes from having more structure in your class periods. Okay, that's tip number 3. My on grade level classes were so much more highly structured than my honors, than my AP Bio classes. I'm not leaving it open-ended. I'm not leaving as much space for discussion, as much space for tangents. Everything is built out. Every minute is planned. There's not this time where it's like, okay, here's something, go off and work on it. We'll circle back in 20. No, I'm using timers. I'm timing every single thing. I'm saying, okay, here's a 5-minute timer. You're going to work in silence on these practice problems completely by yourself. When the timer goes off, you're going to come together with your partner. You're going to compare what you did with them, see if you guys can help each other for another 5 minutes. Then we're going to get together and we're going to go over this as a class. Like I am constantly keeping the pace in these classes so that they don't get off task, so that they don't get distracted, and we can reclaim every single minute possible to have it because we need it. We need as much time as possible to get these things covered in our class periods. And so if you need help with precise planning of your time and tight transitions between your instructional activities in your course, check out episode 92. I share all my best pacing tips there. It's something I'm really, really passionate about. But so I think having that solid structure in my classes, especially these classes with a higher percentage of struggling students, of low achieving students, makes all the difference. Now, I mentioned back when I talked about having more time for reinforcement in labs, that's where we're going to circle back to this now. Tip number 4 is I highly recommend if you have a class period that is lower achieving, no matter what the designation of the class is, would you consider doubling the time for the lab that you would do in a higher achieving course? Okay, so for example, if you block out 2 days to do this natural selection lab in your honors class, block out 3.5 to 4 in the other section, in your struggling section, in your on grade level section, so that they are not rushed and you can provide more support. I have found so much with my lower level students that oftentimes lab days, they just totally see as like fun days and goof off days because they just accept that they're not going to learn anything from it. And they're like, it's an opportunity to be out of my seat and be social. And then I'll try to copy the answers from someone else when she makes me inevitably turn something in here. They don't see the immense value in doing a lab. How if you're being really strategic with the labs you choose, these are invaluable instructional opportunities to better understand what we're learning. And so I'd rather do less labs and spend more time on them. So again, they're not rushed. They feel the freedom to ask me questions. I typically don't put limits on my lower achieving students in terms of the number of questions they can ask me. With my higher achieving, I usually typically say like each lab group can only ask me, 2 or 3 per class period. They have to ask each other first and use all your resources at your disposal to figure things out before you come to me. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to create more space so we aren't having to rush through it. And I find oftentimes the frenzy and the stress of a lab day comes around being rushed. And so I eliminate that in my CB classes by literally adding double time as needed. And then you can provide more support for them too. Help them with those graphs. Have every student, if you have to, come up after they've labeled their axes and make sure they've evenly spaced them before they even start plotting points. Have a conversation with them. Hey, before you even start drawing anything, should this be a line graph? Should this be a bar graph? Should you connect the dots on the graph if it is a line graph or not? start having those conversations, and you can only do that if you have the space to do it. So definitely block off more time for your labs. If you can't do double, just even one extra day will make a difference. My fifth tip for serving these students is more guided inquiry and less full inquiry. I love inquiry. I totally see the value in inquiry-based investigations, inquiry labs, like all the things. But at the end of the day, we have to reclaim more time in these classes, and we don't just get extra time. We have the same length of class period as any other class, but we need more time for reinforcing. We need more time for skills practice. We need more time for labs. And so one of the ways we can do that is kind of pull the reins back on the inquiry and do more guided inquiry, smaller inquiry activities that introduce a topic that can only take 15 or 20 minutes. And then diving in a little bit deeper into the content, I find are really, really effective for these on grade level classes that might have the higher percentage of lower achieving students. Number 6 is arguably the most important tip, which maybe I should have put it at the end and kind of built to there, but we're already running with it. So let's just keep going. Is y'all equip these students with tools. The lower achieving students get the most tools in their toolbox. Okay, this can look like so many things. It can look like reference sheets on tests. It can be as simple as on the top of practice handouts, you type in the equations that they're going to need for this practice handout, just so they have that as a quick reference. It could be outlines for any research-based project. That's one of the ways I scaffold my research projects in my courses. I mentioned in my last episode 169, my genetic disorder research project that I do in biology. For my on-grade level lower achieving classes, I give them a list of topics to choose from that I know that they're going to have no problem finding research on. And then the second thing I give them is I give them an outline for research. This could be as simple as here are 10 questions for you to type into Google. Or it can be, a little bit more open-ended. It could just have some labels and things like a chart that they're going to fill in to get the information. I do this for my superhero project in physical science too. I used to teach physical science to 8th and 9th graders. So they were definitely, even if they weren't just low achieving in general, they were just, younger students that needed more scaffolding when it came to understanding how to do research well. And so I highly recommend doing that. That's a tool that you're giving them. All of those are different tools. Now, let's say you're oh, how do I come up with these things? How do I just it's hard enough to come up with the project and the rubric. How do I come up with the outline and the list of topics and all of that? Here's what you do. You do the same project in your CP class and your honors class, okay? But you have your honors class do it first. Let's say you give them a day in class to research and decide on what genetic disorder they're going to research. Then you see what they've come up with and say, hey, what do you want to do? Have you found a lot of information on it? That kind of thing. You start building your list of topics from there. If they want to research some disease that runs in their family and you realize this is kind of obscure, you're not going to find a lot of information, or, this is actually much more complex in terms of how it's inherited, then you're going to really be able to grasp, let's take this off the list. That's how you start to curate your list. And you can reuse this and add to it year over year as students find new things that are good topics to research. You can say, hey, what were some of the things you Googled at the end of class? Make it an exit ticket in honors, y'all. Say, hey, write down 2 of the things you put into your Google search in order to find great information today when you're researching. Or even better, hey, before you leave, every person needs to email me the link to one website you used as a great source for information. And then you put all those on a Google Doc and you distribute those as tools for your lower level students who need more support. Okay, then again, you're repurposing it and you're not having to just start from scratch in serving these students. You're using your other classes to have a little bit more autonomy, like we talked about last episode, and having them take the bulk of this and then using that to create tools for your lower level students. That's how I recommend scaffolding those types of things, but we're going to give them more tools. My 7th tip is to evaluate your tests and make them more structured and have lower Bloom's taxonomy questions. Think if this is a 2 or 3 part question, don't just write the question. Break it down into the 2 or 3 separate parts and say, this is part A of this question, part B, part C, or just simplify it all to step A. So it's not as overwhelming of a leap for them to climb in their thinking process to get there. I never do compare and contrast prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Instead, on a CP test, because I give them an answer sheet, it would have a chart and it would have blanks for them. And it would say 3 differences, 1, 2, 3, 2 similarities, 1, 2, that they're going to fill in. That's the kind of structure that's so good for them. You're not modifying the content. They're still having to learn the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. But the way they're going to share their understanding is going to be a lot simpler for them, as opposed to just saying, hey, write a short answer about comparing and contrasting these 2 types of cells. So that's what we want to do with our tests. Much more structured, lower Bloom's taxonomy questions. And of course, you can always do less questions too. Number 8, for my tips for serving your lower achieving students, know that they need more time to learn content, of course, but they also just need more time to learn how to learn and to just practice learning skills. Okay? So hopefully you'll have more time to do this as you're covering less content with them. But this is things like they need more support with how to take notes. Like even if you give them completely filled in notes, which we'll talk about next week, you need to teach them how to engage with those filled in notes. How while you're lecturing, they can be highlighting certain things or marking certain things or writing questions off to the side or just active listening and then asking you questions as you're talking. Like we need to teach them how to do that. We need to teach them how to make study guides, how to study, like how to do things in lab, how to make graphs. And all of this is going to be best done by modeling. Again, it's going to feel like a lot more teacher-centered in that regard. But if it's like, I go, now you go, we take turns, it's going to get them engaged with that. But they're going to need more time with skills practice. And I think if you just have that expectation going into teaching like an on-grade level biology course and saying like, I can't just dive into macromolecules. Like I know I'm going to have to like really review a lot of this stuff more. I think it's just going to get you in a better headspace to not feel like you're constantly behind, but to have a better idea of like, no, I'm just like serving my students and meeting them where they are. And I know that they're going to need more time to learn these skills. Okay, so let's review. We're going to have clear expectations, lots of reinforcement, more structure, double our lab time if possible, more guided inquiry and less full inquiry. We're going to equip them with more tools than we would like an honors class. We're going to look at our tests and make sure that they're very structured. Our answer keys are more structured. They have lower Bloom's taxonomy level questions. And yeah, we're really supporting them and helping them get to the answer with tools even in the answer sheet that they're filling out. And then 8, we're going to build in more time for them to learn and practice the skills that they're going to need, just basic learning and studying skills. And then last but not least, number 9, just like with differentiating for higher achieving students, we can serve our lower achieving students by offering them more choices. Allow students to show what they know in a way that suits them and their learning style best. If you can do a whole choice board with 9 options, more power to you. It could be as simple as just giving them 2 or 3 choices for an output. Hey, you can write this or you can draw this. You can demonstrate this with like a more hands-on thing, or you can create this sort of model for your more artistic students. Like just giving them options is so helpful. Also, as much as like they need support and they need tools, I also think giving them freedom to learn as they need to learn is so helpful. For instance, with study guides, yes, I model for students how to make a study guide. I do this at the very beginning of the school year, and I'll link a blog post I have about how I do study guides for you. But I also really encourage students, like, this is how I would make a study guide because this is something that I like to study from visually, but you may feel differently. Maybe yours needs to be more tech-based. Maybe yours needs more visuals. Maybe yours needs to be more physical, have flaps, have something you're using with your hands so that you're engaging with it that way. Maybe yours needs to be something that you're recording and then listening to is more auditory. I don't know, but giving them those choices to create study tools for themselves in a way that really serves them, I think is going to really help them as well in your class and down the road. Now, those are my 9 tips just for like a general class that's just lower achieving across the board. So I know I don't want to leave you hanging, even though next week we're going to be talking about mixed classes with like a ton of range in your abilities. I don't want to leave you having to wait 1 week. So my last tip for you is for those outlier students. Specifically, if you're teaching like an honors or an AP, an advanced course of some kind, and there are students in there that are lower achieving, like they honestly may not have been put in that course. Like if you had been there, maybe you wouldn't have put them in it. Maybe their parents pushed them to do it. Maybe they're one of those students that's like, I'm honors everything, even if really they should only be honors English and history and maybe on grade level math and science. I don't know. I don't want to put labels on them, but we're talking about those outlier students in your honors course that are really, really struggling. If you're anything like me, you might be exasperated with them. You might be just frustrated, like you shouldn't be here in the first place. You had a choice and you chose to be here and now you're not stepping up and now it's my fault. Like I would get frustrated like that. Sometimes there's more going into it and maybe it's not their fault that they're there. Maybe their parents forced them. I don't know. So if you're anything like me and you're feeling impatient and exasperated with them, here's one way you can serve them without exasperating yourself, okay? Tools. Give those students some of the tools that you're giving your CP biology or your on-grade chemistry level students and help support them. So for example, you're doing a research project, maybe no one else in that honors course is getting the research outline, but you're going up to them and saying, hey, you're slipping them a printout and say, hey, use this while you're researching for this project. Or hey, here's 2 or 3 websites that would be helpful for you. Or hey, come after school today and I'm going to walk through your study guide with you how to do it so that then you're more equipped with this skill of making a study guide for future study guides. So in like my CP class, I'm doing this as a whole class with everybody. With these outliers in an honor class, I'm saying, hey, come meet me and we'll do this together once and then you can run with it from here. Like one of the biggest tools I push for those outlying students is tutoring. I'm a huge fan of having a consistent tutoring time. Mine was always 30 minutes after school every day, 3 to 3:30. And really encouraging them, like, come in, I will help you with this. I will walk through this with you. You probably just need more reinforcement. I will help you with that and be there for them. And then at the end of the year, have an honest conversation with them as they're picking their courses for next year's schedule and just say, hey, what is your reason for picking this? Do you feel like this is really best for you? Here's kind of what I'm thinking. And you can kind of go from there and making sure they don't fall into this trap of feeling like they have to be all honors all around. Okay, so that's your take-home challenge for today. That's your one tip for those outlier students. Serve them with tools. For everyone else, for just your general on-grade level courses, pick one lab or project or test and apply these principles to it and see how you can scaffold it and differentiate it to better serve your students and help them get to where they need to be. And stay tuned because next week, I'm really excited to dive into those questions y'all have been asking me about mixed level courses and how to say, hey, I've got 35 students in this one section and it is a wide range. How do I serve them all? We're going to navigate all of that next week. So make sure you come back to listen. And you can find this week's show notes at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 170. And I would love it if you would leave a review today, if you haven't already. If you heard something new in today's episode that you haven't thought about doing before with your students and you're excited to implement. All right, teacher friends, that wraps up today's episode. If you're looking for an easy way to start simplifying your life as a secondary science teacher, head to itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/challenge to grab your classroom reset challenge. And guess what? It's totally free. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you here next week. Until then, I'll be rooting for you, teacher friend.